Next item on the agenda is an update from the Office of Broadband Development. So we have Angie on, and I think she's got a number of things to update us on, including maybe doing a little bit of a double click at some of the comments Commissioner Grove made earlier. So with that, Angie, I will turn it over to you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and so good to see you all, and can't wait till we can all meet again in person, and looking forward to that this year, hopefully. I'm going to share my screen, and as the Commissioner mentioned, we've created a 2-page document in our office. It kind of helped us frame up how we're thinking about the federal funding and what we're thinking about in terms of next steps. So I'm hoping you all can see my screen. We start with a bit of where we're at on our progress towards Minnesota's broadband goals. And this document will be on our website too by the end of the day today. So you all will have it. I think some of you may have seen draft versions of it already, but this was our final look at it. But to date, the state has invested over $126 million through the border-to-border broadband grant program. The thing that we're all thinking about right now is what our next steps are with these capital projects fund dollars. As you all recall, last session, the legislature appropriated $70 million out of the state's $180.7 million of capital projects fund monies, specifically for the border-to-border grant program. We have submitted I should take a step back. So with capital projects fund, there was a 3-step process that the states had to go through to get access to the monies. The first step was to submit really a general application stating that we're the state of Minnesota, we're eligible for the funding, and yes, we want to accept all of the funding. That happened at the end of last year. Not too long after that, we submitted our program plan for the $70 million of border-to-border broadband grant program funding. I'm still holding out hope that we will get approval of that program before the end of the month. But as we're learning with federal programs, we are at the mercy of their timeline and their processes. So we, in anticipation of receiving approval, we posted our scoring criteria for the fiscal year 22 grant round in anticipation that Treasury would approve our program plan as it is. On our website, we make note of the possibility that Treasury may require us to make a few changes, and if that's the case, we will adjust appropriately. But the reasoning behind putting our scoring criteria out when we did was so that we could launch a grant round as soon as we got approval from Treasury, because we're required to get that scoring criteria posted at least 30 days before we issue the RFP. So to be clear, the intent is to launch the $35 million grant round in fiscal year 22, and then very early in fiscal year 23, which would be in July, issue another RFP for that second $35 million out of the capital projects fund monies. As Devin mentioned earlier, with this federal funding, there is another $110 million that can be spent through that program that the governor has authority to spend and invest. We understand that those monies will be split across the 3 categories of projects that can be funded with the capital projects monies. In the infrastructure category, the devices category, and the community facilities category. There is also, as we discussed earlier, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act on the horizon, and the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Act within it, or BEAD. And what we know for sure is that Minnesota will receive $100 million for broadband funding through that program, and likely more. The balance, anything on top of that will be determined based on the new mapping that's being done by the FCC. There are optimistic folks who think that that might happen yet this year. I'm thinking it happens sometime next year. And then here is what we know today. We know that we have at least 240,000 households that lack access to our 2026 goal of that 100 by 20 service. We very conservatively estimate that it will cost Minnesota $1.3 billion to connect those homes. Now that number was based, or how we arrived at that number was based on a cost estimate that the task force used a few years ago in its annual report. What we know from talking to some of our current grantees and broadband providers around the state is costs are going up with inflation, increasing costs of labor, supply chain issues. Across the board, we expect that these numbers will actually go up. But also what we know for sure is that public-private partnerships are needed to get everyone connected, and we'll continue to promote those partnerships. And the fourth point here is that the governor did put $170 million in state investment in his budget proposal. So to be clear, that $170 million is in addition to all of these other federal dollars. This is out of the state's budget surplus. So these would be state dollars. So when we talk about our path to the finish, in looking at the estimated costs to connect those homes, looking at the requirements in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that the state or the sub-grantees within the state provide that 25% match, we came up with this rough estimate of what it would take for us to get the job finished. We know we have the $70 million allocated out of the capital projects fund monies. There will likely be additional money out of that capital project fund that goes towards infrastructure. We just don't know what that is yet. We know there will be the $100 million in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. What we don't know is what additional money may come on top of that. We contemplated RDOF. As you are all aware, we're still waiting on final approval from the FCC on some of those awards. So we, again, estimated that perhaps not 100% of those RDOF awards would actually come to fruition. And this is how we get to, along with the local investment of ARPA funds, we know cities and counties are investing heavily there. We anticipate that additional BEAD funding through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. We anticipate federal funding via other sources through USDA and FCC programs that award grants directly to providers, communities, and tribes. And of course, we anticipate and are grateful for the continued private investment by Minnesota's broadband providers. Also want to talk a bit about the mapping work we're doing at DEED. We are again contracting with Connected Nation to do our mapping work, and we will fund that mapping work with the capital projects dollars that have been allocated to the program. And this backside of this two-pager includes really information for your reference on the different funding programs that are available. We're in a whole new sea of acronyms now. Our office intends to promote the availability of the Affordable Connectivity Benefit Program in the early stages of thinking through some of those possibilities in terms of how our office could best partner with folks to get the word out about the availability of those funds. We also know that the state still has $1.1 trillion of unspent ARPA monies. Broadband infrastructure investment is an allowed use, and to date, no, the state hasn't put any of those dollars into broadband. Back to the capital projects fund, just a reminder that there were those three buckets of possibilities with that funding. So we have infrastructure, the digital connectivity technology projects, that's to purchase or install devices and equipment to facilitate broadband internet access. And then there's the multi-purpose community facilities project. Again, more detail about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, but what I haven't touched on yet is some stakeholders across the state. Minnesota will receive funding to create a digital equity plan. And then once we submit that plan and it's approved by NTIA, then we will also receive funding to operate a digital equity grant program that will support and fund projects across the state. I would share with you all that our office is getting ready to post a job opening. We will be hiring someone to lead this work through the Office of Broadband Development. We'll certainly keep you posted about that. And then shortly after, I'm guessing that we will be hiring a couple of additional grant administrators to help us with the work on the digital equity side. And then lastly, this document includes some definitions. These definitions are from the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. I want to give those folks recognition. And I think this is a good point for me to stop and take a breath.
Thank you, Angie, and good explanation. I see a couple hands up. So Brian, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Teddy. Thanks for the presentation, Angie. Just trying to read the tea leaves here. So if we do, the state does 35 million in 2022 for the Office of Broadband Development. Looking at 35 million in 2023, are you anticipating the additional $100 million will be used to fund the program out to 2024, 2025, and 2026? Is that how you're anticipating utilizing those resources? Or if the legislature comes to agreement and Governor Walz's 170 million is approved, are you potentially looking at maybe 2 rounds of funding in 2022, or maybe even a greater amount in 2023? So I know there was a lot of questions there, but just kind of curious on how we're going to move this thing along.
Thank you for that, Brian. Yes, what I would anticipate is that we would spread those whatever additional funding we receive across multiple grant rounds over the next 2 to 3, 4 years, depending on our timeline with the funding source in terms of being able to get those dollars spent out. And what I like about that, and I think for folks who have been advocating for base level funding for this program too, what I like about that approach is it gives a planning horizon. And so for the communities that are getting up to speed, beginning their work and putting those partnerships together, it gives them that planning horizon, knowing that there is a definite cycle to that funding. The broadband funding in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act also requires a 5-year plan from the state in terms of how those dollars would be spent out. So we could anticipate seeing that kind of planning horizon there as well.
Thank you, Angie. I also understand that some of your hearings and presentations, there's been relatively good support for maybe looking at increased grant opportunities, or maybe something more than the 50-50. So that would potentially allow you to maybe do something in specific for the more rural areas and difficult to serve.
I'm hearing that as well, and yes, it's something we've heard from folks across the state in prior grant rounds. The challenge around areas of the state where that 50% match still doesn't lead to a return on investment for the folks who are investing there.
Thank you.
Mark Johnson has a comment or a question.
Thanks, Teddy. Thanks, Angie, for all that information. And thanks, Brian, for asking the question I was going to ask. So to get when that money's going to come. But I've got another one. First of all, will you share that document with us? Is that something that we can? Okay, yes. Very good. And then second, the digital equity money that's there potentially. How is that going to be distributed? Is that a block grant to states that the state has to decide whether to give it to OBD, or can you tell me just a little bit more about that?
Here's what I know, Mark, that we expect that NTIA is going to put out the notice of funding sometime in May or June. But what we would expect is that the state would submit its letter of intent to accept those funds, and that the program would be run through the Office of Broadband Development, and then the subsequent grant programs that would be created there would be a sub-grantee process. So the funds would come to the state of Minnesota and then be distributed through the Office of Broadband Development through competitive grant process.
Thank you.
And isn't it exciting that we have the opportunity to even have this conversation? I know the task force has been advocating for funding in this area for quite some time, and I'm really excited that we're having this opportunity.
Yeah, no, Angie, that's a good point. And I think a lot of the questions are more coming from a place of like, just clarification and making sure we understand. But I think we could speak to a lot of us. I mean, this is really exciting. And the fact that there's funding coming from multiple sources is a good thing, because that also spreads the risk just in case, something doesn't pan out or doesn't work out as good. I mean, there's many places where this could come from. So I think that's very exciting. Like when we met with Commissioner Grove, I think what's also interesting is the numbers are, 170 million is a big number, but at the same time, I think the 1.3 million or 1.3 billion dollars, right? That's really what's required to get to the 2026 goals and get Minnesota's connected. That's the number that's front and center, and then how do we chip away at that is going to be the task here. So, Steve Georges, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, we're all going to be waiting on the Fed to release these funds. The FCC has to go through a whole mapping process before they can release any of the IIJ funds. In your presentation, you talk about some of the communities and counties using ARPA funds for projects. And I think that's true, but the reality is to tie it into some of the state funds, because they were federal funds allocated, which aren't available. We've lost the whole year of construction, and we're probably going to lose another one. And we're sitting on $1.1 billion that can be allocated tomorrow. Where is the pressure? Where is the push to get the state to take those 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now? We're not meeting our goals. We're not anywhere near our goals of being in the top 5 in the nation. It just seems that, perhaps with the supply chain, the issue and falling to actually do something. When you see the state of Virginia allocating $600 million now, they're going to be connected well before Minnesota. Mississippi is going to be well connected, fiber to the premise, because of the actions they've taken now. So again, I'm just, we can all be happy that there's potential here. The 170 million from the governor is a proposal. The legislature has to embrace it, but there's 1.1 billion that's accessible. Why aren't we pushing to have that utilized now? So not, I'm not criticizing anybody. I'm just saying, maybe there's another. We have to remind the legislators and push them to utilize now.
Well, Steve, it's not just a reminder, right? I mean, there's other things that everybody's going to argue about. So anything you can do also, to kind of remind the various legislators that could be advocates for it and push for it hard. And, as other arguments come up, I think what Commissioner Grove has done as far as tying it to more economic development, see, it's not about broadband, right? It's about we're the 50th in the state when it comes to, AP classes taken in computer science, the jobs in rural communities around technology is not there and it could be there, right? These are the things that I think people have to start to recognize of what it could do, right? Because otherwise, it could easily be taken as, well, yeah, it's nice to have internet, but so you could watch more Netflix or Prime Video or whatever, and that's not the point. And so I think those are the things we have to continue to push for, and even the report we've done and make it more digestible. And I think you're kind of pushing in an area as well as focus for us in 2022 is what we can push for is these types of messages to reinforce to people. I do like the fact that the 170 million that's not tied to the state funding or to the federal funding, right? So federal funding is almost like icing on the cake now. So it's okay if that comes, then great, right? We could use that too. So we made good movement, but it's a good reminder. I mean, it's a good push that you bring up. Angie?
Thank you, Tay. Just one last comment in that regard. It is true. The state funding gives us a whole lot more control and flexibility, and that's my hope that with that 170 million, that bridges that gap between now and particularly when the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act money begin to flow. Don't want to be ungrateful for the federal funding opportunity in any way. They're different pros and cons with both types of monies, and then again I have to remind myself we are talking about more money than I would have ever imagined, and certainly once in a career opportunity for me to work with a program of this size. It's something I frankly I didn't think we'd be here. I look at so many of you on the task force have been working on this issue longer than I have, and it's an extraordinary time, and it's our opportunity to get it done and get it done right, and move on to other great work. Let's get this work done. Thank you, Teddy.
Hey, Angie, quick question on the 180 million, of which 70 is allocated obviously to infrastructure, and then the other 110 million. Has there been any discussion? Because I mean, that's probably going to be approved sooner than later, and when Treasury approves it, I think it's for the whole 180, and then it's for Minnesota to decide what to do with the 180-70, of which has been spoken for, hopefully, and not questioned. But then the other 110, I know there's areas that could go into devices and community. I mean, has there been any more discussion in that space at all?
We have been having those discussions at Seed and with the governor's office, and I anticipate the decision will be made there relatively soon. Can't say exactly when, but those discussions are ongoing, and like I said, we would anticipate additional programs submitted to Treasury in each of those three buckets. In additional money in the infrastructure, and new money for devices, and new money for community facility projects.
Okay. Thank you. Other questions, comments for Angie and the OBD? Hands up or any comments, anybody coming off mute. So thank you, Angie, for that update. And again, I think you said you would that document would be available on the site as well. Awesome. Thank you. Okay. Okay, moving on to the next piece. Now, this is, of course, we talk about sort of topics for the following year and things like that. What I wanted to do was get a little bit of feedback on sort of what you thought about how we did work last year. Subgroup format, how was that? Do we want to continue that? The report itself, the way the report was put together, did you like that? Is there any changes from that? Are there any sort of other structural things in the way we bring sort of speakers to the task force and then discuss and all that? Happy to hear that. A little bit about that. Would love to get together face to face. Now that probably be in the second half of the year. That looks more likely than not now. So probably won't be the next two meetings, but the ones after that, we may get an opportunity to do that. If we do that, I know, Mark, hopefully the invitation to come at the school is still open and we could do that. Visiting tribal lands, that was another option that was thrown out before as well. So anyway, so would love to get some thoughts around that. So maybe we start with the structure of the subgroups with various topics and then kind of bring you back to the overall task force and having discussion there. Did that seem to work? Is everybody okay going forward with that format, or would you like to see something different? Brian?
Thanks, Teddy. I thought it worked really well. I think that the way everybody put their tasks together, and then we came together and everybody had a chance to provide input to the other groups, I thought went well. And I thought the electronic report this year was outstanding. I think it was very well received by legislators and a better format to communicate our report.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Others? And again, if you notice, there was a little bit of from the subgroups, didn't want to leave all the work in the subgroups. It was just a matter of bringing sort of the topic to the forefront and then really having that more robust discussion. Hopefully that came through the way we intended to and the way we were hoping at the beginning of the last year. So, Teresa?
I like the subgroups too. I think we may need to tweak them, especially with all the funding coming in, maybe kind of tracking that. Also, as Commissioner Grove said, the digital equity, kind of focus on that too. And yeah, just we don't have to decide today the topics, but maybe we could all brainstorm and then come March or do a doodle poll and kind of everybody decide what they want and then vote on what kind of committees we'd like to have. Just my thought. And I don't know, do we need to have the committees report monthly or every other month? I mean, sometimes we tend to repeat ourselves. And also, I like it when we have presentations. I could ask the FCC again if they want to, the EBB program went away and January 1st is a different program, similar but open to more people for the low income internet. And maybe that person at the FCC could update us on that and how it's going. I know that there's an awareness challenge right now, and I spoke on it this morning at a county meeting. So, and again, Comcast was open to doing a head-end tour. I think Brian Cranber wanted to do something off-site too. Maybe in the summer we could do a site visit and look at fixed wireless. He kind of wanted to show us that. I don't know, Brian, if you still want to do that. They had some ideas in the back of my head, but yeah, if we can get out and see things and do more presentations, I think that'd be awesome, and I'd be willing to help with that. Thanks.
Good comment, Teresa, there. I think if we continue with the subgroups, one thing we can also do is be more where the subgroups focus their attention, right? So maybe at the beginning of the year, it's like bring topics for the task force for presentations and locations and things like that. Then we switch to like major topics, and then we switch to sort of recommendations. We could do something like that, where it's a little bit more, there's a little more structure throughout the year. So that's a good suggestion. I like that. Bernadine?
I wanted to offer my appreciation to OBD's office for helping kind of staff and participate in our working group. One of the reasons why it was really nice to have an OBD person with us was they could help bring in threads from the other subgroups. You know, they're not clear boundaries. There's a lot of overlap of topics. it was really helpful that they could bring in and say, well, this group is, that just, so I wanted to just, in terms of processes going forward, having that ears and eyes from the supporter that can see all of the conversations across the task force subgroups, I think really helped.
Oh, good idea. Good suggestion. Okay, sorry, just writing it down. Other thoughts?
Just me again.
Right, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't know if that was an old.
That's all right. I agree with Bernadine about having somebody with OBD willing to join our meetings, and also something to think about. The report did look really nice this year, and I don't know if we want to rehire Scott Cole again, or if we just use that as a template, but that's something also to think about maybe further down the road.
Yeah, just a little bit of insight into that one. We can get Scott again. I think that was helpful from an organizational standpoint, but we can't get him till the second half of the year, right? The budget only allows for us. But I think it's right, like about right around the July timeframe, he can join us, and then start working with the subgroups on surfacing up recommendations or thoughts, and then organizing it throughout the end of the year.
Yeah, he did a good job reining us all in and trying to define what we were trying to say. So thanks, that'd be great.
Yep. Other thoughts on, so as far as, places to have tribal lands, we mentioned that. Mark, you said the school, that'd be great. Brian, maybe you said maybe something down in your area. That could be an interesting one. Teresa, was there other ones you mentioned that I missed?
Comcast was willing to do a head-in tour. That'd be in the metro area. We'd have to circle back with them, but they were open to it last year. Just didn't happen.
Yeah, that's right. Any other venues to that we should probably just add to, not that say we're going to do it, but just to add to the list that you think of right off the bat? Others, open to everyone.
I was going to say Land O'Lakes so we get butter again, but I suppose that we already did that.
Could do that. Well, we could go to a facility, a milk processing facility. That'll be in a rural area. That could be an interesting one.
You just have to bring butter.
Yeah, that's true. But I have to find one where it comes off the line right there. So we'll have to see if there's one in Minnesota for that. Anything? Okay, so locations, format, we liked it. We'll talk about topics for subgroups. So obviously from a topic standpoint, I know Teresa brought up the sort of, there's all sorts of areas of funding, that's kind of tracking that and where are we and what's happening. And even to Steve's point earlier is that there's an area we can push and submit letters or whatever we need to do. That could be an interesting topic in itself. Sort of tracking what's happening at the federal level, both from the new program that was mentioned, the affordable program there, but at the same time, even the broadband mapping aspect of it and what they're doing there. There's lots of things that are going to be happening in that space, in that area. That could be an interesting one. Mapping for the state. I know Angie mentioned kind of getting together with Connected Nation, but that could be an interesting, really topic to go down a little bit further on. Digital equity, that's a good one. I think that's an interesting one as well. This idea that Commissioner Grove also brought up on future investments. Okay, so beyond the 2 to 3 years, like if you look 10 years down the road, what are areas that we should be considered for investment? And that could be the case for having base funding and for OBD, and kind of putting that up. I thought that was a good one. And then the positioning communities to take advantage of the funding once broadband's available. I think that's that's an interesting topic to ponder as well. Other topics that come to mind, again, this is not the end all be all. What I think I'm going to do is probably send out an email with a list of here's some proposed location, here's some proposed topics that we can look to into the future, and then we sort of can make it up to everybody, and everybody can sort of chime into that, and then we'll kind of collate it and bring it back at the, Teresa, as you mentioned, in the March meeting, and we can start to organize ourselves that way. That could be an interesting way to think about it. Bernadine?
Thanks, Teddy. Yeah, you just mentioned about the need for local and regional governments and teams and communities to be ready and equipped to make the best use of all the funding coming. And I'm remembering that was one of the recommendations that we included in our task force report to the governor and the legislature, along with a whole raft of others. And I'm not aware that anybody is carrying any bills that would address some of those points. I mean, we talked about the match, we talked about total cost, the Connected Minnesota, Lead from Minnesota, those things like that. Do we as a task force have a line or a sight line to encouraging that any of our recommendations show up in legislation before the legislature?
That's a good question. One thing, even from one of the federal task forces that I'm sitting on, we're trying to push for is what's the life of the recommendation a little bit, right? Like, where is it going? And sometimes what's a little difficult about it is they take portions of it or it gets combined with something else. So it's not an exact one-to-one match, but there should still be a way to track that. So yeah, I'm writing it down. Maybe there's a way for us to keep line of sight to the recommendations and what's been done, what's portion of it. And if it hasn't, how do we surface it back up again, maybe in a different way that could be carried forward? That could be an issue.
Yeah, thanks for that, Teddy. I do think as we look towards, our recommendations for this year, that's a good starting place. So what we recommended last year was or was not acted on? And are those recommendations still meaningful, or do they need to be adapted in some way? But just as a starting place, because we put a lot of time and effort in those recommendations, they're not showing up, as far as I know, in the legislature this year.
Yeah. Okay. Yvonne?
Just throwing out some other possible topics. Security. Reflecting on, Bernadine's statement about everything's better with broadband, maybe, right? Think about security, privacy, and reliability. I'll throw those three topics out as things that we might want to think about especially in terms of that long-term future stuff. I watch a lot of dystopian science fiction. So
the cyber stuff, I don't know that that's so much science fiction anymore.
No, it is. And we're on the curve now, so it's time for us to, as a state, be thinking about what the implications are of having fully connected state in terms of the government's ability to track each of us, et cetera.
Yeah, and the cyber, that's a good point. The cyber piece, both the cyber and privacy, I think we could bring some state experts as well to talk to the task force to get some thoughts on sort of what's happening in that area. Now, not necessarily that it's 100% applicable to what we're doing in broadband, but at least get some perspective there. I know there's a state chief security officer with a whole team. We could hear from that, as well as I think there is someone focused on data privacy, or at least has expertise in that. Okay, Brian?
Thanks, Teddy. Maybe one other topic we've had it, I think the last 2 years has been the unserved. But I think that's still kind of the mission of what this task force was put together for, is to deliver broadband to all corners of the state. And I know Angie's been getting a lot of feedback on the match program, 50%, should it be higher? So I think that might be another topic just to continue to address, is the current border-to-border broadband program and any tweaks that we need to do it on matching or line extension or anything else that we've addressed here.
Yeah, I like that, Brian. I think that's a good idea, and I think that even ties into with the mapping side of it, right? So meaning the 171,000 households that we talked about, like obviously part of, I think, the partnering up again with Connected Nation is to validate the 171,000. Are those the areas? Are those the locations? Then what providers and what areas do we need to focus on? I think that goes with what you're saying here, which where is the real unserved, and then in some of those locations is 50% correct, or does it need to be more because of other because there's other circumstances that prevent it, for providers to get even in that 50% range. So, okay. Steve Georgie?
RDOF. Not going away.
Tracking that, see what's happening with the RDOF or what's not happening?
Well, a lot of states, and again, there's probably some legal reasons why that some of these awardees have been disqualified. And I'm just curious if, again, Minnesota as a state can take a position on this or not, because again, we're just marking time here. We're just marking time, losing another year in rural areas. And now RDOF has got this. So we're going to have to deal with it either with some of these state funds or federal funds. So.
Okay. Okay. It's a good, healthy list. That's always helpful to not only organize the subgroups, but also decide on presentations, venues, all those kind of things. So that really helps kind of line up. And obviously from a speaker's perspective, once we create the subgroups, we'll look to those to bring relevant speakers to the task force. But that could help us even get a couple of folks lined up for March. And a lot of it has to do with aligning schedules and making sure they can present at a given time and all that. So, and I know Carol and Angie will certainly be helpful in kind of getting that lined up for us. So that's super helpful. For the most part, that's what I have for today. Is there any other topics that anybody wants to go into more detail about? Something we haven't covered today? Again, didn't want to make it a big start, more kind of ease into the year. But there were some meaty, good updates, right? Good, meaningful updates on sort of funding specifically. Nope, not seeing any voices, not seeing any hands up. Anyone that's not on the task force that's on the call, is there any other business you'd want to bring up? Any other announcements that you'd want to bring to the task force at the moment? Okay. Not hearing anything from anyone outside of the task force either. So with that, I think we pretty much covered all the topics for today. Good start. Again, we'll get some of this sort of data dump organized. You probably see a couple of emails come out before the next meeting. If there are other things that come up, topics, again, ideas for discussion, presentations, venues, feel free to add that. I'll probably have it sort of broken out into those types of categories. We'll get that back. Once we get that back by a certain date, hopefully I'll have that date in there as well. Then at the next task force meeting, we'll have a couple of speakers lined up, and then start to maybe organize what the breakout of a subgroup might look like, and then we may even do some voting and who wants to be on which task force and things, or which subgroup and all that. So I'll get us organized for the year and get prepared for another fun one to get into deeper topics and have some great recommendations, and some of them might be the same ones just reiterated again, which, as we know, tends to help. So all right, so with that, I want to thank everybody for your time, for the attention, and we'll talk to you next month.